In 2016, in the bustling streets of London, United Kingdom, a dark tale began to unravel, a story steeped in manipulation, control, and devastating tragedy. This case stands among the most chilling, leaving an indelible mark on those who hear it. As we journey into this harrowing account, prepare to uncover the sinister depths of human behavior, where blind loyalty led to unspeakable acts. At its center is Zahed, a man whose life became the battleground for power, coercion, and betrayal, a story that culminates in a conclusion as brutal as it is haunting. But before we dive into today's case, I just want to remind you to like the video and subscribe if you're new. Your support helps me a lot. Thank you. Zahed was born in 1974. Not much is known about his early life or family, but it is clear he had a history of trouble with the law. He was charged with burglary and dangerous driving, and as a teenager, he was warned for an incident at Manchester Airport. In his late 20s and early 30s, Zahed lived in Sheffield, England. During this time, he claimed he was in a serious car accident that put him in a coma and left him needing a wheelchair. This story about the accident comes only from Zahed, with no official records to support it. This makes many people doubt if it is true. In the early 2000s, Zahed began using online dating sites. His profile picture showed stacks of gold bars in the background, making it seem like he was rich or had a connection to wealth. Zahed's fake image of being wealthy worked when he met Kay Roworth online. In 2005, Zahed was 31 years old, and Kay was 44. Kay was born in 1960 and had married her first husband at a young age. Kay had 2 children with her first husband, but they divorced in the early 1990s. She lived in North Shields, a town near Newcastle in northern England. One of Kay's close friends, Helen O'Keefe, later shared that Kay worked as a carer and was a kind and caring person. Helen described her as gentle and genuinely lovely to be around. Kay regularly attended church, where she sang in the choir. She was well liked and stayed close to her friends. Later, she remarried, but the marriage ended in divorce. After her second divorce, Kay fell into depression. She started looking for attention from men and got involved in some casual relationships. One of her closest friends, Susan Gordon, had known her since school in the 1970s. Susan saw Kay as more like a sister than a friend. Kay and Susan used to meet every day, but things changed when Kay met Zahed through an online dating site. Susan noticed that Kay started acting differently. Zahed's control over her grew, and Kay slowly pulled away from her friends and community. Kay and Zahed's relationship became serious very quickly. Zahed asked to move into Kay's house, and because she was feeling desperate, she agreed. Zahed gave her £20,000 to help with her mortgage, but no one knows where he got that money from. Over time, Zahed started controlling everything in Kay's life. He told her who she could talk to and who she couldn't, forcing her to cut off all her friends. Kay became very withdrawn and stopped going to church. Even her relationship with her children started to fade as Zahed isolated her more and more. One day, Susan saw Zahed and Kay in a cafe. When Kay tried to order bacon, Zahed stopped her, saying she wasn't allowed to eat it. Susan reminded Zahed that Kay was Christian, not Muslim, but Zahed insisted she would have to brush her teeth before kissing him if she ate it. Susan later said Kay looked tired and unwell, a shadow of the person she used to be. She grew more worried about Kay's safety and Zahed's control over her. After that day, Kay began avoiding eye contact with her friends if she saw them in public. She would lower her head and walk away. Under Zahed's control, Kay converted from Christianity to Islam, a decision that confused her friends. Over time, Zahed became more violent with Kay, often attacking her with his crutches, whether he was walking with them or carrying them while using his wheelchair. Zahed's anger often spilled over into violent outbursts, including hammering the walls of the house in fits of rage. On one occasion, he even spat in Kay's face. When others questioned his behavior, Zahed blamed it on a head injury from his accident, claiming it had changed his personality. Zahed used his head injury as an excuse to justify his growing abuse while tightening his control over Kay. She tried to leave him several times, but Zahed always stopped her with manipulative tactics. He even claimed to be part of a dangerous gang in Sheffield, wearing a bulletproof vest to make himself seem threatening and powerful. These lies and manipulations kept Kay trapped in fear, giving Zahed complete control over her life. In public, however, Zahed created a very different image for himself. Despite claiming to be wheelchair-bound, he volunteered regularly at a local soup kitchen, helping to feed the homeless and presenting himself as a kind and caring person. Zahed acted like a supportive and caring member of the community, helping those in need. But not everyone believed him. Some people noticed Zahed doing things that didn't match his claims of being disabled. People saw Zahed running to catch a bus, jumping out of his wheelchair during arguments, and even shoveling sand for a garden project. He exaggerated his disability to gain sympathy and financial support while improving his public image with charity work. But behind closed doors, Zahed was cruel, using lies and violence to control the people closest to him. By 2009, after being with Kay for 4 years, Zahed went back to online platforms like Facebook. He was looking for a second partner. Once again, he used a profile photo with gold bars in the background, pretending to be a wealthy and generous man. It took Zahed several years to find someone who would join him and Kay in a relationship. Finally, he convinced a woman named Myra Wood to become part of their lives. Myra, born on October 29, 1966, had a difficult childhood, which left her dealing with depression, anxiety, and PTSD. By 2011, Myra was divorced and had a daughter named Elizabeth. Elizabeth remembered her mother as loving and caring, but everything changed when Myra got involved with Zahed. Elizabeth later said she cared more about him than she did about us. At first, Zahed came across as polite and charming, but in 2013, when Myra finished a 16-week sentence for theft, she had nowhere to go. Zahed and Kay offered her a place to stay in Kay's house. For the first time, Kay and Myra lived together under one roof. Myra later said this was when Zahed's control over her became much stronger. Myra was struggling financially. She worked as a cleaner, but her income wasn't enough to cover her needs. Even so, Zahed started asking her for large sums of money, forcing her to depend on him even more. Zahed made Myra one of his official carers so she could claim a carer's allowance, but he took all the money for himself. Their relationship became more abusive over time. Zahed would often explode in anger during arguments, and the violence escalated. He even strangled Myra several times. Both Kay and Myra suffered under Zahed's control. He would pin them to the floor, strangle them, or slap them. Zahed often shouted that he could kill them whenever he wanted. Sometimes, Zahed threatened Myra with a knife, holding it to her stomach and nearly acting on his threats. Myra revealed that Zahed had disturbing fetishes. He forced both Kay and Myra to drink his urine as a way to show his power over them. Kay resisted, but Myra gave in. Zahed completely controlled both Kay and Myra, but his behavior became even worse. He developed an interest in illegal videos involving animals and eventually got dogs of his own. Zahed tried to force Kay and Myra to engage in disturbing acts with the animals. Both women said they refused, but they remembered Zahed constantly pressuring them. It wasn't long before Zahed started looking for another partner. His next victims were Ann Corbett and a man named Jimmy Prout. Ann was much younger than Zahed and the other women. Born on November 8, 1990, she was in her 20s when she met him. Anne had a difficult life, struggling with instability and learning disabilities, and was often homeless. Zahed saw Anne's struggles and used them to his advantage, offering her a place to live. Since there wasn't enough space in Kay's house, Zahed convinced Kay to get a second home nearby. This second house became the place where Anne, Myra, and Jimmy Prout eventually stayed. Jimmy Prout was born around 1970 and grew up in Newcastle as one of 8 siblings. His childhood was difficult. His mother struggled with depression, and his father was often away for work. As a result, some of the children, including Jimmy, ended up in child protective care. Jimmy's learning disabilities made life even harder for him and left him vulnerable. He once had a stable life with his ex-wife, Mandy Carter, and their 2 children, but things eventually fell apart. Jimmy started taking casual jobs, got involved in minor crimes, and ended up homeless, which made it easy for Zahed to take control of him. Jimmy was known for having a kind and helpful nature, but Zahed used this to his advantage. He made Jimmy do hard labor without paying him. Jimmy became the cleaner and handyman for both houses and ran errands whenever Zahed asked. In reality, he was treated like a slave. Jimmy felt he owed Zahed for giving him a place to live and a sense of family, so he followed Zahed's orders without question. Zahed had a close relationship with Anne, but over time she also became involved with Jimmy. When the group went out, they would walk in a strict order, with Zahed leading and the others following behind him. Myra and Kay walked directly behind Zahed, followed by Anne, with Jimmy always at the very back. This order showed that Jimmy was seen as the lowest in their group. Zahed controlled them all through fear, but Jimmy was treated the worst. In 2014, Zahed attended a Christmas party for the homeless at the People's Kitchen, where he mingled with important figures, including the mayor of Newcastle and Gateshead, who even took a photo with him. But within a year of this, Zahed's abuse became much worse, leading to the terrible events that this case is known for. In the fall of 2015, Anne's brother Ivan moved into the second house because he needed a place to stay. Zahed saw this as an opportunity to bring Ivan into his group. However, Ivan was strong-willed and didn't fall under Zahed's control. This caused tension between the two, and they eventually clashed. Zahed claimed that some of his tools had gone missing. Although they weren't valuable, this made him furious. Ivan decided to leave the house to avoid more conflict, but Zahed turned his anger toward Jimmy instead. Under Zahed's influence, the whole group began to treat Jimmy badly, even though he had done nothing wrong. Zahed tightened his control over Jimmy by boarding up the windows of the second house and repeatedly attacking him. If Jimmy's work wasn't good enough, Zahed would beat him. The women often watched these attacks, and sometimes they even laughed. There is evidence that they also joined in the abuse. Zahed punished Jimmy in brutal ways, including hitting, slapping, cutting, and even suffocating him. He also forced the women to starve Jimmy, giving him very little food to eat. Another form of control Zahed used was making Jimmy stand for long periods of time without a break. Jimmy was too scared to fight back and followed Zahed's orders, suffering silently. It's hard to know why victims stay with their abusers, but Jimmy was likely too weak from the abuse or felt he had nowhere else to go, or both. Still, he tried to reach out for help by posting upsetting photos and messages on social media, hoping someone would notice his situation. Jimmy posted photos of himself crying or showing his weak and injured body. His captions hinted at the abuse he was enduring. He wrote things like, "My mouth hurts, my body hurts, my cheek hurts, my shoulder hurts. I need help. I am in so much pain." These posts showed his desperation, but no one seemed to notice. The only person who reacted to Jimmy's posts was Anne, who liked all of them. The photos clearly showed that Jimmy's shoulder had suffered serious injuries from Zahed's brutal attacks. Zahed's cruelty was growing worse, and his violent behavior was becoming even more extreme. One day, Zahed used pliers from his toolbox to force Jimmy's mouth open and began pulling out his teeth. When he struggled with a stubborn tooth, Zahed used a hammer and chisel to break it out. This horrifying act was another example of how far Zahed's cruelty had gone. Sometimes, Zahed brought his dog to the second house and forced Jimmy to perform disturbing acts with the animal while Zahed watched. The women did nothing to stop this cruelty, either to Jimmy or the dog. What happened next was beyond horrific. Zahed decided to remove one of Jimmy's testicles. Using a Stanley knife, a tool for cutting carpets, Zahed handed it to Ann Corbett and told her to cut Jimmy. Ann made the first cut but couldn't continue. Zahed then took the knife himself and completed the gruesome act. Zahed gave Jimmy no painkillers before, during, or after the act. He cut open Jimmy's scrotum, removed the testicle, and then forced Jimmy to eat it. Afterward, Zahed told Ann to burn the wound with a heated metal rod to seal it, then sew it up. Jimmy was in unbearable pain, but the others in the group only watched and laughed. Later, they even kicked him in the groin. On November 27, 2015, Jimmy went to the hospital in extreme pain. Although his injuries were obvious, he didn't tell the doctors what had really happened. He only hinted that he knew who had hurt him, but fear kept him from saying more. This was noted in his medical records, but no action was taken. The hospital gave Jimmy a sick note and sent him home. On November 30th, Jimmy went back to the hospital, this time with Zahed and Ann. Zahed did most of the talking, claiming that Jimmy's injuries were from an attack and insisting that Jimmy needed a longer sick note. When the doctor examined Jimmy, he found stab wounds. Zahed explained this by saying the attackers failed to stab Jimmy properly because he had been wearing several coats. The doctor remembered Jimmy's earlier visit and noted in his records that Jimmy seemed to be suffering badly. However, nothing was done. A few weeks later, Jimmy returned to the hospital again. This time, a member of the learning disability team joined the appointment. When the doctor asked about Jimmy's missing teeth, Ann claimed that Jimmy had pulled them out himself. The doctor and his team noticed that Jimmy seemed scared, but Zahed convinced them that Jimmy's injuries were self-inflicted and that they were only trying to help him. Despite clear signs of neglect and abuse, no action was taken. Jimmy was sent back into Zahed's control, and the abuse continued. Jimmy's health got worse quickly, and he became so weak that he could only walk if Kay and Myra supported him by holding him up on each side. Surveillance cameras showed Kay and Myra dragging Jimmy through the streets when he couldn't move on his own. Zahed, Myra, Kay, and Ann all treated him with complete cruelty. One horrifying day, Myra and Zahed were on a bus when they showed a local woman pictures of Jimmy's bruised and beaten body. Myra laughed as Zahed showed the images, while the woman was horrified. Jimmy's skin was so bruised it had turned black. When the woman voiced her concerns, Zahed brushed it off, saying that Jimmy deserved it. Another terrible moment happened on a cold morning in January 2016. A neighbor found Jimmy slumped against her gate, wearing only a sleeveless jacket. He was so weak he couldn't stand and could only whisper, "Help me." Despite this and other disturbing events, as well as Jimmy's hospital visits, no one acted on the clear warning signs. There were 17 recorded chances for authorities or witnesses to step in and save Jimmy, but no one did. Tragically, Jimmy's life was nearing its end. It would be Ann who carried out the final, brutal act. In the early hours of February 9, 2016, Jimmy was in terrible pain and screamed throughout the night. Annoyed by his screams, Myra called Zahed. The group decided they needed to silence him. Zahed told Ann to gag Jimmy, and she used a piece of cloth to cover his mouth and nose. Anne later said it was an accident, but Jimmy, battered and broken, suffocated to death. Jimmy died at 6 a.m. When the group realized he was dead, they wrapped his body in layers of clothes and put him in a sleeping bag. They carried him about 100 meters from the house and left him hidden in some bushes, exposed to the weather. To hide what they had done, Zahed later burned evidence in a bonfire. Afterward, the group acted as if nothing had happened. Soon, the group started falling apart under the weight of guilt and paranoia, afraid they might be caught. None of the women were innocent. They either hurt Jimmy or allowed the abuse to continue. On March 25, 2016, Zahed and Anne had an argument that turned into a fight. Zahed called the police, claiming that Anne had attacked him and killed Jimmy. In a desperate attempt to escape blame, Zahed tried to pin the entire crime on Anne. When the police arrived, they found Zahed pretending to be extremely upset, with Kay and Myra acting distressed around him. However, his story didn't add up, and the police became suspicious. The next day, Zahed, Anne, Kay and Myra were all arrested for questioning. Zahed, Kay and Myra planned to blame everything on Anne, but in another room, Anne confessed that she had accidentally suffocated Jimmy and told the police where his body was. On March 27, 2016, the police found Jimmy's body. It was badly decomposed and had been partially eaten by wildlife. However, there was still enough evidence to show the horrific abuse he had suffered. His body had many broken bones, revealing a long history of torture. A post-mortem confirmed the brutal treatment he endured. When questioned, the group's lies quickly fell apart, and they were charged with Jimmy's murder. The trial began on May 3, 2017. All four of them pleaded not guilty to murder and showed little remorse for the terrible torture they had inflicted on Jimmy. In the end, Zahed and Anne were found guilty of murder. Kay and Myra were convicted of causing or allowing the death of a vulnerable adult. Zahed was sentenced to at least 33 years in prison and showed no emotion as he was sentenced. Anne received a minimum sentence of 27 years, with some leniency for helping police find Jimmy's body. Kay was sentenced to 12 years and 4 months, and Myra to 9 years. Before finishing the trial, the judge spoke directly to Zahed. He said, "You were the leader of this household and its dictator. Jimmy wasn't enough as your servant, so you made him your victim, attacking him over and over. I'm certain you enjoyed his suffering." As the group left the courtroom, people watching shouted, "I hope you rot in hell."